Welcome to the first episode of Cabpolitical's Data Talk. Per your request on Twitter, I'll offer a weekly video version of analysis of all the races. So I want to just jump straight into it. Iowa's a few days away. What's going to happen? I still have no idea. Let me show you why. Essentially what's been happening as of late is Hillary Clinton's been locked in the model around 46% or so. Bernie Sanders is here at the 45% mark, but look at their bands. Clinton's model bands, there are 6 bands that have broken out for the model this cycle. Clinton's model bands are very well locked in around this 46 to 48% mark. That's much more consistent than they were just a couple weeks ago. Sanders, though, his bands have also locked in around the 44 to 49% mark. A little bit more volatile than Clinton, and perhaps that's not a surprise, especially if we're thinking that a lot of his voters might be less active voters, first-time voters, non-traditional voters, whatever they may be. The point being, we could very well wake up Monday morning expecting this to be a nail-biter until the results come in Monday night. As of now, I'm still expecting that. There could be noisy bands either way. The one thing here is, one, you have to remember the volatility of polls. There's sampling error. There are different methodologies, right? So don't assume if a candidate's at 46.5 and another one's at 46, that actually means the candidate at 46.5 is ahead, right? Social science is good. It's not that good. We've got different kinds of error. As well as the fact is this is a primary. You're asking for trouble if you want to count tenths. As well as the fact that this is a caucus. There aren't a lot of voters in a caucus overall. So expect the unexpected a little bit. But what we're seeing is still a close race until the end, although I'd love to have that Des Moines Register poll right about now. Let's move on to the GOP race. There aren't any new dynamics actually in the last week, except maybe Marco Rubio's rise a little bit. I'll get to that in a second. Overall, a week or two ago, Cruz was still riding high, probably around the low 30s, maybe 30 mark. Trump was probably more in the mid to upper 20s. What's happened in the last 5 to 10 days? They've switched that, right? So I've had Trump at about 31, Cruz still at about 27, but I want to show you their bands a little bit more. Trump at 31 actually might be on the low end of his bands. He's pulling up to 35, 36 in some of the lines. So I fully expect that, barring a surprise, 30% could very well happen for him. 32, 33, 34 seems equally likely, right? But Trump has always seemed like a wild card, right? If his voters come in a surge way that we haven't expected, he could even go higher than that. If they don't show up, watch out. Ted Cruz is still close enough to maybe pull these things off, right? So what about Ted Cruz? I still have him at 27, but here's the big note. Trending down in the closing days, right? There are still some volatile bands that could still pull him up into 31, 32 that I'm seeing, but we've seen just as many bands as of late that could imply that mid-20s might actually be his peak. You never want to be the candidate trending down, even if it's only a few tenths every time I update one of these things, right? So Trump looking good, but we'll see. We're still within that noisy range. So what about Marco Rubio? I've had him at the 11, 12 range for a long time. He really stalled in December and January, but as of now, I've got him pulling up to 14%. There seems to be a little tailwind for him at the end. That's normally a good sign for a candidate, although historically this is broken towards a Huckabee or Santorum. He gets evangelicals, but he's clearly a different kind of candidate than historic breaks, so it's hard to have comps here. That said, if you look at the last week of polling, if a candidate is the one ending with that tailwind, if they get 3%, let's say, better in the last week than they were the week before, they'll probably also get another 3% on election night in those last 24, 48 hours that aren't always captured by the polls. The point being, that would historically put him maybe in that 16 to 18% range. I think that's likely, right? It looks like he's going to definitely solidify third, separated himself from Carson to get up into those mid-teens at least. 16 to 18 would be that wind. Now, if he gets like this super surge, that could get him up to 18 to 21, again, if he's getting some of that Santorum-like dynamic at the end of the race. You got to remember, this is not a Santorum situation. Santorum absolutely surged from 0 to 60 in about 2 weeks. So we went from about 2 to 12 and then 12 to 24, 25 in those final 2 weeks. So you could have seen that 12-point rise at the end, even though it went beyond a lot of those polls. Here, it's that more incremental 3-point rise. That's what it's looking like. Again, mid-teens, but probably sure enough for third. All right, so Now, I'd like to do a quick thing each week where I focus on something that I don't think is getting enough attention. That was Iowa, but I actually want to talk about New Hampshire here for a second, because I think a lot of analysts that you might hear focus on independents in New Hampshire, and they talk at this big macro level. So I want to use this segment to focus on the micro. What I mean by that is this. New Hampshire, open primary. Where independents vote is huge, right? They shape the race. They're often at least 30%, up to 40% of the vote there, but let's think of them as about a third of the vote. Do they go in the Republican primary? Do they go in the Democratic primary? Often you hear that helps John Kasich, that helps Bernie Sanders. They're in the lead with independents within their respective parties. That's true, but these shifts don't happen on the macro level. Here's what I mean. We often think of independents as these moderate voters that could go either way. So here's what we see. Essentially, that's ideology. We've got independents that break down into thirds in terms of ideology. We often think about these moderates. They could vote for the Republican, they could vote for the Democrat, because they're somewhere in between the parties, ideologically speaking. But we also know, especially in recent years, more and more folks have become independents. Some of them are liberal. They don't want to necessarily ascribe to the Democratic Party. They could even be further to the left. They're independents, but they're going to vote for Democrats, historically speaking. Here on the right, more conservative, whether it's moderate to conservative, or maybe it's a Tea Party type voter. They're over here on the right, potentially even right of the Republican Party, but they're still going to default towards a Republican primary if they're going to vote. But that's just ideology. There's far more than that going on. The way I want you to think about it is, imagine it more of a grid. Ideology is just this bottom tier, whether they're liberal, moderate, conservative. Really what's happening with another whole group of independents are, they're actually independent, and they don't necessarily vote on ideology. This is the actual pocket of voters who could be up here, where they could be voting for Sanders or Trump. There are such voters, and maybe they're more in this 3 to 5% pocket, right? The point is, if Sanders and Kasich are the most popular overall, don't look at those top line numbers. Even if a candidate like Trump is only popular with 25% of independents, if that's the pocket of 3 to 5% that shift from one primary to the other, that helps Trump or whoever it is that they're voting for. The point is, Kasich voters and Sanders voters are probably not the same. Sanders voters could be out here on the independent side or down here on the liberal side, but they might not be these ideological-based moderates. Instead, if it's this pocket of 3 to 5% of independents that are really deciding to vote in one primary or the other, these are more likely to be your Kasich voters that could break his numbers from like a 12 to a 15 or an 18 on election night. But these voters probably aren't Sanders voters. These voters are probably Clinton voters, right, that are deciding whether they want to vote for the more moderate Democrat or the more moderate Republican. So don't focus on all this punditry of just these top line numbers that treats everybody alike. Instead, think of voters in these little pockets and see where these little pockets of 3 to 5% of people go. There are such things as Trump or Sanders voters. There are such things as Clinton or Kasich type voters. And that's where the changes happen. That's where the dramatic effects come on election night that we don't always see. All right, so that's it for this week. I'll have the final predictions for Iowa coming up pretty soon. If you make me, I'll predict it. We'll see where I go with that. I'm looking at you, Anselzer, right? I'm looking at you. Okay, that's it for this week. Talk to you next time after the caucuses.